Namaste. Good morning to Vishwa and to people, friends who have joined from USA and other parts of the world, and good evening to friends from India. Uh, Sorry for the short delay in starting the program, the event that we have today. It's a special day for all of us, at least for the people who are in the project. Um, all the members of the project are together for the first time after we have began the project at least 1 year back. So that's how it's a special day for the project. Dr. Joydeep Bagchee, today's distinguished speaker, and Professor Vishwa Adluri, who is the international principal investigator of this project. Dr. Geetesh Nirban, co-convener of the webinar, and distinguished invitees, dear friends interested in Mahabharata scholarship. I welcome you all to this 25th session of this series of webinars on Mahabharata as hosted by Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, and Kamala Nehru College, University of Delhi. So this is how it is once again a very important landmark. 25th one is being joined by our collaborators. These webinars are being organized under the aegis of Spark project, which is a scheme for promotion of academic and research collaboration, an initiative of Ministry of Education, Government of India. The title of the project is Yoga Consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, an ethical value for societal and political well-being. We are working as a team for this project, along with, as I have already mentioned, Professor Vishwa Adluri from Hunter College, City University of New York, USA, and Joydeep Bagchee from Germany, who is associated with Hindu University of America, and Dr. Geetesh and me. Our extended team consists of Ms. Jayashree Jha, Ms. Anmol Preet Kaur, Ms. Megha Kapoor, who are the research scholars at the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, and Ms. Deepshika, who is a postgraduate student who is working with us. As far as our project is concerned, it is our collaborative attempt to revisit the Indian epic to explore yoga consciousness as one of its underlying messages, like, I'm sorry, yeah, looking at yoga consciousness. So the when it comes to the objectives of the project, we wanted to look at or to build a new approach to yoga that combines theoretical and practical perspectives, and we also wanted to look at and understand yoga beyond a set of postures as an overarching term for salvic practices, and to see how it is embedded in social and political reality. And in this process, we are also trying to reappropriate texts of classical Hinduism which have suffered from the Orientalist approaches in order to articulate the vision of yoga consciousness. And in this process, we try to demonstrate how answers to the question of right action at societal and political levels can be explored through the conception of yoga consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita that transcends sectarian and doctrinal boundaries to create a global system of thought and practice. And we also would like to look at in this project how to explicate the universal and philanthropic and humanitarian aspects of Hinduism as echoed in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita. That is the pointers that we have in this project, or looking at yoga consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita specifically, and also looking at ethical values of societal and political well-being. And the focused question that we would be dealing with in this project is what is the right course of action and how to identify it, how to perform this action that is identified in an appropriate way. So these series of webinars that we have been witnessing all these weeks are our humble attempt to make the various aspects of Mahabharata reach the diverse audience who hold interest in the study of the epic. We started this series of webinar during the extreme phase of lockdown to engage minds with Mahabharata. We have had the privilege of hosting scholars of repute from universities and organizations in India and abroad, wherein diverse topics related to Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita have been touched, ranging from social and political well-being, ethical dilemmas, consciousness, karma yoga, instrumental violence, environmental influences, dialogical consciousness, and many more topics pertaining to the epic, all as an attempt to explore Mahabharata for the human well-being. And we feel so happy to host one of our colleagues and the collaborators in the project, Dr. Joydeep Bagchee, and also along with him, Dr. Professor Vishwa Adluri also would be speaking today on the theme, the Mahabharata War and the teaching of yoga. And in the previous sessions, we had a thorough discussion on concept of yoga and consciousness by Professor Pradeep Gokhale and many other distinguished scholars on the same platform who tried to explain us what yoga is, or how Mahabharata or Bhagavad Gita specifically has conceived the concept of yoga in terms of samatvam yoga uchite, which means equanimity being seen as yoga, and also yoga karmasu kausalam, which means skillfulness in action. And Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita definitely presents a wonderful view of a combination of karma, jnana, and bhakti yogas. So I think without wasting much of your time, I should invite Dr. Geetesh to introduce the speakers formally today, so that the things go further and we would be getting a very good intellectual feast from these two distinguished scholars who have with us today. Over to you, Dr. Geetesh.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Namaskar and good evening to all in India, and good morning, Vishwa, and our participants from outside. We are very privileged to have amongst us Dr. Vishwa Adluri and Dr. Joydeep Bagchee. Dr. Joydeep will be delivering the address, and Dr. Vishwa will join too. So, Dr. Joydeep Bagchee is Dr. Adluri's student. Before I go on to introduce Dr. Joydeep, I would like to introduce Dr. Vishwa Adluri, who is a professor of philosophy at Hunter College, New York. He's the author of over a dozen articles and essays on the Mahabharata. His work mainly focuses on the reception of ancient thought, both Greek and Indian, in modernity. He's the author of Parmenides, Plato, and Mortal Philosophy, Return from Transcendence. His second work is The Nay Science, A History of German Indology, and Philology and Criticism, A Guide to Mahabharata Textual Criticism. He has edited numerous volumes on the Mahabharata, including Argument and Design, The Unity of the Mahabharata. Dr. Vishwa has a PhD from New School for Social Research, New York, a PhD in Indology from Phillips University, Marburg, and PhD in Sanskrit from Deakin College, Pune. We are so honored to have him amongst us today, and also very honored to have him as the international principal investigator for this ongoing project. His student, Dr. Joydeep Bagchee, is a Berlin-based researcher and intellectual historian. He has a PhD in philosophy from New School for Social Research, New York. He has studied Indian and Western philosophy and completed a PhD in German philosophy under Dr. Vishwa Adluri's guidance. He is co-author with his teacher, Dr. Vishwa Adluri, of The Nay Science, A History of German Indology, and the other work, Philology and Criticism, A Guide to Mahabharata Textual Criticism. He has also co-edited the volume, Argument and Design, The Unity of the Mahabharata. Dr. Joydeep teaches courses at the Hindu University of America as a co-doctoral faculty member. It is a joy to share that Dr. Joydeep is delivering the 25th address in the ongoing series of webinars, as Dr. Bala just mentioned. We are really honored and privileged to have amongst us our international collaborators on the Spark webinar platform today on a Sunday evening in India. I hand over to Dr. Joydeep, who is going to be delivering an address on the Mahabharata War and teaching of yoga, wherein Dr. Vishwa Adluri will also be joining us. Over to both of you.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Great, wonderful. Thank you, Gitesh, for that invitation. Thank you, Bala, for introducing the project. And I am so honored to be a part of this project. It's a fantastic, fabulous thing. Geetesh has been doing a lot of work. She's actually collected all of you over all the weekends that she's been running these seminars. And it's no small task to coordinate 3 time zones, Europe, India, USA, and to find time in our busy schedules. She had to keep running after us and get us to promise and hold. And if we're a little late today, it's because my dog, who is 16 weeks old, and sometimes he just decides, I've had it with behaving and being good. And today, while I was putting together the final stages of the PowerPoint, he just had one of those moods where he needed to be walked. So I ran down.
Just like the Mahabharata, a dog interrupts the sacrifice. That's how the Mahabharata also, the composition begins. But continue.
His latest thing is the potted plants in my apartment. He's been digging the dirt out of it. So you're seeing the scholarly edifice, and below it, he has covered my living room in dirt. So, okay, that was just an aside. Let's start with the PowerPoint, which I have for you today. And the way we're going to do it is I'm going to show you the first half of it. It is the same one that Vish has, but we put it together. So I'm going to do the first half. He's going to expand on the second half, and I'll keep the screen share running. If you have questions, feel free to ask, but either ask them in the Q&A window or in the chat window, so we can take them whenever it's convenient, and we can pause or we can take them at the end. But do feel free to ask questions. All right, let's go.
I will be here. So while Joy is presenting, if there is a question I can answer, I will type the response for you in the chat window.
Okay, this should be the PowerPoint, and now I can go to the big screen view. Okay, so everyone see this?
Yes.
Wonderful. So let's start from the very beginning about how we tend to approach the Mahabharata. This is not Western scholarship. This is a pair of Indian historians, and this is from a book edited by Upinder Singh, whom some of you may know as a historian from Delhi University. And this is their table, which I've just taken 1-to-1. And they say that there were 3 phases or 4 phases of expansion of the Mahabharata. The Jaya is the battle account. It's the heart of the whole thing. It's the original Mahabharata. And because wars don't need a lot of description, it's only 8,800 verses. This is then expanded to a Jaya Bharata of 24,000 verses, which then becomes a Bharat Itihasa of 24,000 verses, and finally the Mahabharata. So this is a traditional picture. It's not just these 2 scholars. There was a workshop on the Mahabharata at Bhandarkar Institute where a very well-known Sanskritist was speaking. And her introduction, I didn't attend the webinar itself, but the introduction told exactly the same story. The original epic, which was the Jaya, which was about the war, which was gradually expanded to the Mahabharata. This is the way we've become accustomed to looking at the epic. It's about the war. That is the heart of it. Now, this is not entirely false in the sense that there is a justification, or these verses can be interpreted as a justification, because the Mahabharata itself tells us that some people recite the Bharata from Manu onwards, others from Astika onwards, etc. And some from the story of Uparichara, which is the story of King Vasu that comes up in the Adi Parvan. There is also a verse that says that there is a version of the Bharata, the sage made a version without the Upakhyanas, that is the additional narratives. And so people think that that must have been the original version, the smaller one, and then the Upakhyanas were added later, although that's not contained in the verse. That would be how you explain the expansion. Neither of these work for very simple reasons. The interweaving of the different narrations, the Astika story, the beginning from Manu onwards, and so on, they are so complexly intertwined that you cannot break them apart. It just doesn't work. Each narration, each starting point presumes the other one, and there are motifs that recall the other one. The second reason the story that adding the Upakhyanas makes the Jaya into a Mahabharata doesn't work is if you take all the Upakhyanas and count them up, the numbers won't add up, or the length of the Upakhyanas won't get you to a Mahabharata alone. So let's look at a different way to look at these 3 starting points. The 3 frames are philosophical beginnings. philosophical approaches to the text. This conception is part of the literary design of the epic, which moves from the violence of war, that is the so-called core, to the regulated violence of sacrifice, and ultimately to the peaceful setting of the Naimisha forest. I hope all of you know enough of the Mahabharata to know that when we first enter the Mahabharata, when we first hear the Mahabharata, it is with the story of the bard Ugrashravas reaching the Naimisha forest, where he meets some assembled sages, and Shaunaka is the head of those sages. They're performing a sacrifice. And then they ask him, where have you come from? He says, I came from the famous land of Kurukshetra. I attended Janamejaya's sacrifice at Takshashila. There I heard the Mahabharata and so on. So this is the outermost beginning, which is narrated in the Naimisha forest. A better way to understand these three versions is not as different historical versions of the epic, but as literary philosophical tropes. Each setting is symbolic. Each setting actually replicates or resembles or reproduces the modulation that the story is undergoing at that retelling. So by changing the settings and tellings, the text preserves the dialogical mode throughout, layers various models of action over, not over each, but over each other: war, war sacrifice, snake sacrifice, and finally the literary construction that takes place in the Naimisha forest. Today, we're going to focus on the Rana Yajna in its components of war and sacrifice. Why are we focusing specifically on the Mahabharata war books today? Because if you read the other parts of the Mahabharata, right, the philosophical parts, the ritual parts, the meditative parts, you could imagine there's a pure war story, right? You could think, yeah, in those other parts, it's just about war. But when you read the war books themselves, they completely destroy this fantasy. The war books are the ultimate proof that the Mahabharata is not about war. It is not the other books. The other books will tell you that it's about philosophy and so on. But as we will see in a bit, Western scholars for a long time set their evidence aside and said, oh, those were Brahmanic additions. We don't need to believe them. It was about a war. The argument for today's panel is, when you read the war books, you will see it is not about a war, but about yoga in a very wide sense. But all these motives will work towards what we have called in this project yoga consciousness. Okay, next slide. So what do these three frames look like? I mentioned the outermost setting is the Naimisha forest. So this is the peaceful Sylvan setting where the Mahabharata is recounted and where we hear it. This is also the part of the Mahabharata where we get the maxim ahimsa paramo dharma. So ahimsa is the highest dharma, and appropriately enough, this message is not given to the warriors fighting in the heart of the text, which would be absurd, right? It would be a mockery. It is given to these peaceful sages. They have reached that level of reality, that level of being, where ahimsa is even possible. Within ordinary embodied life, it is not possible. Even if you're not a brutal soldier or a killer, some amount of violence is part of life. Our bodies are consuming themselves. Forget consuming other animals. You know, there are cells in your body that are devouring other cells. So life is this ongoing violence in order to survive, to struggle, and to live. And the Mahabharata is very well aware of that. Okay, what is this innermost level? As I mentioned, Ugrashravas comes to the Naimisha forest. He says, I was at that sacrifice where the story was recounted. First he asked the sages, what story would you like to hear? Interestingly enough, they already know about the Mahabharata. And they say, tell us that story. So much for the thesis. Remember what I said about the frames being so intertwined, you cannot separate them? Here's the first proof. Within the first 4 or 5 lines of the epic, the sages say, tell us that famous story, the Mahabharata, which was composed by sage Vyasa. How is that possible if he's just brought the narrative? So clearly this story in its entirety existed, and that frame is not a historical development, but is part of the staging of the epic. Anyway, he says, I was at the snake sacrifice carried on by King Janamejaya, and there I heard the whole story as was recounted by Vaishampayana, and then he recounts the story. What is the snake sacrifice? If you don't know it, it's a straightforward story. Janamejaya's father, Parikshit. Parikshit, you all know, is the last survivor in the Mahabharata war. He is the descendant of Arjuna and thus also a descendant of sage Vyasa. He is killed by the snake Takshaka. When Janamejaya learns about this story, he is enraged and he says, is there a sacrifice I can perform to gain control over the snakes? His priests tell him, yes, the snake sacrifice. He says, perform it, and he performs it. While the sacrifice is beginning, in walks Vyasa, followed by his disciples. He sits down, Janamejaya asks him for the story of his ancestors, and Vyasa tells Vaishampayana to narrate it. So the Mahabharata is actually narrated in the intervals of this sacrifice. It is during an ongoing snake sacrifice that Vaishampayana is telling the story. Ugrashrava somehow isn't sitting nearby or has heard that story, and he then carries it outwards to the Naimisha and then retells it. So these two narrations are layered over each other. You cannot separate them. You have to understand that the action is ongoing and simultaneous in a way. Okay, what is the innermost frame? The innermost frame is what Vaishampayana tells Janamejaya. It is the story of the conflict between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Now here you do actually get a war, and it is a violent war, but that war is also not war simpliciter. It is not a simple battlefield narration, because that war is explicitly called and repeatedly called Rana Yajna. So it is the sacrifice of war, or the battle sacrifice. And there are explicit descriptions eulogizing the war or comparing it to a sacrifice and assigning roles and saying so-and-so is the Yajamana, so-and-so is the priest, etc., etc. I will heap up this sacrifice of war. There are actually two parallel passages in the Udyoga Parvan where that description is very explicit. Okay, let's take it up till there. We don't need to get more into the frames, but we need to understand that this superimposition is part of the logic of the Mahabharata. It is not a gratuitous aesthetic gesture, right? So Vyasa, or the composers of the Mahabharata, did not do this to show, oh, we're clever. It's not an additional aesthetic sort of thing they've added. It is part of the analysis of action. How do you transmutate action, which is violent, into something that is regulated violence, i.e. a yajna that happens at the Sarpasatra? And finally, even though acting, how do you come to a place of no action? This is actually a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. He who sees action and inaction and inaction and action, him I call a yogi. I think that's the verse roughly, if I remember rightly. Wish can look it up while I go on. So you can see how that one sentence of the Bhagavad Gita is at the heart of the Mahabharata. That sentence is not straightforward. Try to see inaction in action. Can anyone do it? Try to see action in inaction. Now, it's not as simple as lying on the couch and eating chips and saying, oh, I think I'm very active because I'm watching ESPN Sports. You know, that statement is hugely puzzling. And if it's so puzzling, it might need something like 100,000 verses or three-stage narrations to work out how is it possible to see action and inaction. So this is the final telling where we have reached that stage aesthetically and philosophically, and the message of the Bhagavad Gita, which is given as a maxim or as an aphorism, has been translated into an experiential reality. But for that, to experience that reality, you have to read the Mahabharata a couple of times and read it over and over till this logic sinks in. Okay, what stops us? This, as I've laid it out, it seems very simple and straightforward, right? This is a philosophical work. Like all literature, you have to sit with the damn book. There is no other way to appreciate a book. The first time you read War and Peace, you might find it terribly boring and you might not see the greatness in it. You have to sit with literature for a while. Why don't we do that? Why are we so over hasty in our judgments? Why do we want to cut apart the text? We come to something called German Indology. As Kitesh mentioned, Vish and I have studied this for the last 15 years. So there is a hemorrhage of meaning through the way the text is now approached. The description of war in the text is considered an imitation of an external war. The text is reduced to banal perceptual reality, losing its poetry. If the Mahabharata were about a real war, no one would remember it. Who today remembers the Gulf War? We all do, right? As a fact, there was a Gulf War. Was it number one, number two, number three? We're not sure. Which year did it begin? 1991. Can anyone here mention the date on which it ended? No one. Can you name a general? One general?
General Schwarzkopf.
Everyone knows Schwarzkopf. And now general number two?
I don't know.
So we don't know the name of the second general. Do we know the name of any soldier who was killed in it? No. So you see, war becomes very forgettable. War can be reduced to a few dates and a few lines. War can be reduced to the story of, the USA fought Kuwait, etc., etc. You can tell a bit of the background, reaching back 20, 30 years in the Middle East. But war is inherently forgettable. Now, name me some Mahabharata generals. Anyone, not just Vish. Turn on your mics and speak if you wish. Anyone? Are you unmuted? Can you all unmute?
There are so many, right?
Yes. Name me a few.
Karna.
Mm-hmm.
Bhishma. We should start with Bhishma and then go on. Drona, Karna. And from the side of Pandavas, you would find this Drishtadyumna and then many others, right?
Now, don't you find it interesting? We saw the Gulf War with our own eyes, live. It was in our lifetime. We saw it 24/7 on the most vivid medium possible, cable television. This is a book, many of us may not have read the original Sanskrit version. We may not even have read the complete thing in translation. No one has seen Bhishma. No one has seen Drona. There is no photograph. Later on, I'll show you some images, but these are all, idealized representations. And yet we remember the names of these generals. So there is some kind of distinction that needs to be made between the poetic power of the imagination and mere history. And in reducing the text to history and saying, there was a real war and the Indians have forgotten it, and let's help them recover that real war, this is inane. If it was a real war, it is by its nature forgotten. And anyone who's trying to dig up a real war and reinvent it is fantasizing, fabulizing. This is mythology. So history is mythology and mythology is real. That's the message I want you to get. Let's also understand in a modern sense by taking a contemporary philosopher, one who died, I think 84 he died, Foucault. And Foucault says, how does one introduce desire into thought, into discourse, into action? How can and must desire deploy its forces within the political domain and grow more intense in the process of overturning the established order? And ars erotica, ars theoretica, ars politica. So we need an erotic art. We need a theoretical art. We need a political art. How do we do this? Through introducing desire into discourse and into action. You will find the Mahabharata is a contemplation on this statement. And what was done to it was to evacuate desire from thought, to evacuate thought from discourse, to evacuate discourse from action, and then to evacuate action itself as any kind of meaningful activity and arrive at this husk, this carcass called history, which was taken as the real, devoid of all meaning, devoid of all human motivation. And, so this is the problem with the way we have approached the Mahabharata. We have gone from avidya to kama to karma, not even to real karma, but fantastic notions of this may have happened, this could have happened. Let me go back into the full screen view now. Okay, where does this hermeneutic come up from? Our reading of text is never in a vacuum, right? We always belong to some hermeneutic community. Here we're looking at three hermeneutic communities of the biblical revelation. The Jews, who will read the Hebrew Bible as containing a prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. So they read it for signs of the coming Messiah. For Christians, the Messiah has arrived. Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, is the anointed one. That is why he is called Christ. Right? This leads to something called covenant theology, which is theology based on the notion of God's covenant. The first covenant, which was with Moses being fulfilled, you have the new covenant, etc. There is another word for this, which is supersessionism, that the New Testament fulfills, or the arrival of Christ fulfills and replaces the old, the promise that was made. So Christianity is the successor to Judaism. It is the fulfillment of Judaism. Logically, now, if you've correctly read the Bible, if you've understood it, you should no longer be a Jew, but turn to becoming a Christian. And finally, Muslims, whom we won't discuss here, who's hermeneutic, it practices Islam supersedes Christianity also by acknowledging Jesus as one of the prophets, but not the final one. Okay. Something interesting happens with Luther. All of you know Martin Luther, the great reformer. This debate about how to read the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, right? If you read the Old Testament as still being valid, it has not been fulfilled, then you don't need the New Testament. You read it as the Hebrew Bible. But if you think it has been fulfilled and you have the New Testament, then the Hebrew Bible becomes the Old Testament. This is a debate about how to read texts, right? Christians are telling the Jews, why are you reading the Old Testament still without the New Testament? Your book is radically incomplete. You cannot understand the meaning of your book until you add this appendix. And from that appendix, you have to read the main text backwards, or you have to read the appendix back into the main text. This debate could not be won on interpretive grounds. And because it could not be won on interpretive grounds, Luther moves the debate to history and says the answer is given in history itself. Look at history. You will see the Jews, this is the green part highlighted, so read with me. The Jews have now been living for almost 1,500 years under great hardships and in uninterrupted captivity, and they have nothing of the promises of which the Lord is speaking here. Speaking here, Genesis. So this is, we're still in the Old Testament. So the promises of the Old Testament have not come true for the Jews. If God is truthful in his promises, then they must be liars. So history itself shows that their reading of the Bible is wrong, of the Hebrew Bible is wrong. So history becomes the place where salvation is enacted and divine favor revealed. This is an entirely, I know some of you are thinking, what does this have to do with the Mahabharata? I'll get there in a second. Think about it. The locus of how to read a text is being moved. Debates about the correct interpretation of text are being moved out of the text into a new place called history. Do you all get that? Now, think about what we started with of the Mahabharata. Interpretation within the text. How does this story work with this story? How is this layer overlaid on this one? How are these narrations working together? These were taken out and taken outside the text into a process of historical expansion, for which we had the table by the Indian scholars saying Jaya, Bharata, Mahabharata. Yes, Vishwa?
Yeah, this is not just working on a European level as a conversation between Judaism and Christianity. The notion of history allows European colonizers to act with the explicit permission of the Pope to colonize. So people who are historically disenfranchised are these people who have not converted to Christianity. So as either liars or primitive people or undeveloped, unprogressive, primitive, merely old, merely having some past, we should be treated as children by Europeans who are Christian and progressed. This is not a this is so vast that we keep this out of our consciousness. So when we say, oh, that's traditional, I'm not traditional, I'm modern, in even use that perceiving ourselves even as traditional, we hand ourselves over, or all cultures are handed over to the supersessionistic logic here. We are merely in the waiting room of history, according to Dr. Chakravarti of Chicago. So with the whole of all cultures in the world will become subjects at a German or the Western university in departments such as anthropology, history, early history, history of the Middle Ages, history of primitive people, and so on. Uh, 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 it's amazing that we have emerged from such a tectonic shift, almost unscathed. If that the Mahabharata remains as the singular testament to rejecting, or at least an Archimedean point from which to view the horrors of why history became the method of human sciences and how detrimental it is to the in the study of humanities. Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to put that comment there because I feel very strongly about it.
So this is what, this is John the Baptist pointing, the picture is painted by Matthias Grunewald. It is the central panel of the Isenheim altarpiece. It's a very, very important work of art. I actually have a lecture on YouTube about this work of art, relating it to Heidegger, but you can see Mary is swooning, and John the Baptist on the right is pointing to Christ's wounds. It is, of course, anachronistic. He would have died before the crucifixion. In the foreground, you can see the Lamb of God, and its blood is being drained into a cup. Now, that is a sacrificial symbol, right? So the sacrificial thing is now being fulfilled through Christ, and he is providing the ultimate sacrifice through which the sacrificial order will be ended and grace will manifest. And that is the fulfillment of the Jewish religion, which was a sacrificial religion. And now you simply have grace through Christ, and all that is required is faith. That finger is telling you that is the Messiah. Believing in that, you are always already saved. Okay. Just as a matter of art historical interest, look at the background, you will see the sea behind, or the ocean, not ocean, sorry, the sea behind where John the Baptist would have baptized Christ. So there are these little, you can interpret this painting for hours. It is beautifully detailed and very interesting. But the fulfillment of sacrifice through Christ and the replacement of Judaism by Christianity and then the turn to history, these are elements that the Mahabharata will also triangulate in a different way. And one day Vishwa will give you a lecture on that. That is not my theme today. My theme is to show that this notion of moving to history is brought into the Mahabharata also by a certain German scholar by the name of Christian Lassen. He was actually Norwegian born, but he's a German Indologist. He was Schlegel student in Bonn, lived his whole life there, is buried in the cemetery there, and is one of the important representatives of Bonn Indology. This is his interpretation of the Mahabharata. I omit an investigation of the names Pandu and Krishna, white and black, and merely throw out the conjecture that they are to be interpreted as the originally native black race and the Sanskrit-speaking light-skinned race that had immigrated from the north. And this is the battle between them. The Mahabharata is this primeval racial conflict in Indian history. At this point, remember what I said about intertextual debates being taken out of the text and put elsewhere? The Mahabharata's war is now taken out of the text and put outside the text in this highly imaginary place called history. Why highly imaginary? Because no one has seen this race war. There is no proof of this race war. There is no way to link this race war to the Mahabharata. And as Indians, you will know that Pandu and Krishna don't fight. And that makes absolutely no sense. So for 200 years, they will tie themselves up in knots explaining how Pandu was actually not Pandu and so on and so forth, and making the racial parity or disparity work. But at this point, we introduce or we enter a new space of interpreting the text and a new way of approaching the text. There is a Kshatriya core, the actual war, which, as you can see on the slide in front of you, it's a primitive conflict. This is actually Tacitus against the Germans, and that was the paradigm they used, the model they used. So there's a Kshatriya core, which is original and historical, and then there are Brahmanic interpolations. All the philosophical ritual components, they're secondary, they're late, they've been added, they're theological, they're didactic, they don't belong. This is then carried on ever further, and the text is fragmented or atomized. So you have a core historical battle, then Brahmanic ritual, then Brahmanic theology, then Shaivism, then classical Hinduism, maybe a Bhakti movement, and you can always discover new layers. At this point, it's impossible to read the Mahabharata as a continuous philosophical manual, as a philosophical experience machine. It is impossible to read it as literature, because even if you've never read the Mahabharata, even if you've not read world literature, great literature, why do we read something as simple as a detective novel? To enter an experiential realm. If you're on the bus and it's dusty and it's dirty, and you read, I don't know, Lorna Doone, because I was watching a program about Lorna Doone yesterday, you enter the highlands and you enter a different world. So all literature is about that immersion and an experience. When you do this to a text, the possibility of immersion in a text goes away. So it is utterly destructive of the literary qualities of a text. It does not, by the way, we've heard many scholars at conferences try to defend themselves saying, oh, we're trying to understand the text. This is not how you understand anything. I have never met an architect who's gone to the Parthenon and blown it up and said, I'm trying to understand it. That was at most done by the IS, the Islamic State, or by the Taliban, who said, to understand this statue, we need to blow it up and then examine the chunks. At least they were more honest than these Western academics. They didn't have that pretense of, oh, we're doing it to understand. Okay, let's continue. So now let's come to the Mahabharata itself with this preface. This is Suktankar, the creator of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. If you have questions about the critical edition, happy to answer them, because Vishwa and I wrote a commentary on his critical edition. He came and he realized what was going on with the Mahabharata. Around 1933, published the first volume, and he undertook to preserve the textual tradition. Very far-sighted man, realized that these manuscripts are disappearing, and he had to preserve all of their knowledge, their information. So he puts an end to the speculative approach, and he gives us a fundamental grounded text, and we can now interpret this text. Here he is explaining the Western text historical model. We've already seen this graphically, but let's read it. The Mahabharata is a veritable chaos containing some good and much useless matter. It is a great pity that a fine heroic poem, which may even be found to contain precious germs of ancient Indian history. So the only value of this core would be that it had some germs. It could tell you, for example, did the Aryans come with chariots, or did they come with bullock carts, or some nonsense like that? I'm being deliberately facetious, but you see how I despise these questions. But we can disentangle the submerged epic core from the adventitious matter known to textual critics as interpolation. The Mahabharata problem thus reduces itself to the discovery of criteria which will enable us to analyze the poem and dissect out the epic nucleus. This is the analytical theory of the origin and character of the Mahabharata. I will not read the second quote. I will give you all these quotes in a handout or in the chat window afterwards. But Suktankar says this method called higher criticism, which tries to look for the epic nucleus, is entirely worthless in case of the Mahabharata. This method has been applied to comparatively more recent and also much simpler works about whose historical context we happen to be better informed and where it would be much more legitimate. Yet even in these cases, it has, as is well known, completely broken down. So Suktankar is aware of Western debates here, and he says, even in regards to Western texts, higher criticism has not stood up. And there we actually do have some historical dates and facts. For the Mahabharata, there are almost none. Where does this method of higher criticism come from? This atomizing, fragmentary approach to text? No surprise, it is a development of biblical hermeneutics, and especially a development within the school of Neo-Protestantism in German history. And that Neo-Protestantism traces itself back to Luther, and there is a very strong anti-Judaic or anti-Judaizing tendency within that movement. I won't read you the whole quote, Vishwa, and I've done many presentations, some of them are online, about the connection, but I just had this quote for you from Rabbi Schechter, who came from Romania, moved to Western Europe, and then ultimately came to America. And he has this wonderful quote where he says, he mocks higher criticism, and he says it is higher anti-Semitism. The higher anti-Semitism which burns the soul though it leaves the body unhurt. So if you apply this to India, think about it. The higher anti-Semitism or the higher criticism of the Mahabharata critics burns the soul but leaves the body intact. It is somehow, it bothers you when you read these interpretations. And it's very easy to say, oh, this is Hindu right-wing, etc., etc. But we have to think about it. Why are these people being bothered by certain interpretations, right? When someone says, ooh, it hurts, one way is to treat the person like he's nuts. The other is to say, wait a minute, something must be amiss. Something cannot be gelling if a whole bunch of people are in pain when they read certain things. So that has been Vishwa and my project, has been to try and understand why are these interpretations painful, where have they come from, and how have they been imposed onto the text? Okay, let's end that. Now let me come to the war books themselves and to the yoga parts of the Mahabharata. The beautiful bird on the left, does anyone want to guess who that is in the Mahabharata? Take a guess. Is there a character called Parrot in the Mahabharata? Shuka. So that is Shuka, the son of Vyasa, who will ultimately gain moksha in the Mahabharata. And so he is signifying, the author is telling you through his own son, I have written a moksha shastra. There are also explicit verses that narrate that. But what a stroke of literary genius, not just to say this is a moksha shastra, but to have a son who within the text itself gains moksha. So he is saying my production itself is something that ends up with moksha or ends up in moksha. If we look at the war books themselves, we find narratological tropes and philosophical ideas are moving even the war narrative. So here we come to the 5 war books, the Bhishma Parvan, Drona Parvan, Karna Parvan, Shalya Parvan. The first 4 are named after the generals. So Bhishma is the general for up to the 10th day of the war. Then Drona takes over, then Karna, then Shalya, and finally the Sauptika Parvan is the book of the sleeping warriors, where many of you must know that Ashwatthama goes into the camp at night and kills the remnant of the Pandava army, except for a few people. Each of these books poses a philosophical problem. So if we go back to our debate of was this a simple war and were there 5 generals? No, it doesn't work like that. Because why exactly these generals? Why in this order? At the end, we are told that Shalya Parvan is greater than Bhishma Parvan. Shalya is a greater warrior, a greater hero than Bhishma and Drona, and not even Arjuna can kill him. Only the Dharma Raja, King Yudhishthira, can kill him. Makes no sense, right? Bhishma was the greatest warrior. So far, we've not heard much of Yudhishthira's fighting skills. Arjuna was the great hero. So all these weird things come up if you think this is a straightforward logic. But if you look at it philosophically, then you will see that in each book, each parvan, a problem is being worked out, a philosophical problem. Let's take the first book, the Bhishma Parvan. Who is ultimately responsible for Bhishma's death? Shikhundin. Now, Shikhundin is, as you all know, an androgen, right? Used to be a woman, is now a man. Bhishma is destroyed by an ambiguous gendered figure. But who is Bhishma? What does he represent? He is always called, or very often called, the Pitamaha, right? So he is the grandfather, the head figure of the patriarchy. The patriarchy will crumble. The normative order that he represents will crumble. The Vamsha, the genealogy that he stands at the head of and he guides both sides of the family, will fall. Bhishma is the grandfather related to the cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Do you know of another grandfather figure in Hindu mythology? Who else is called the grandfather among the gods? Put it in
Brahma
chat.
Prajapati. Brahma Prajapati.
And who are the fighting people there? The Devas and the Asuras, right? So we have certain motifs here which indicate that this is about the Devasura Yuddha, the conflict between them. Bhishma stands at the head of that conflict, a little outside it as the Brahma Prajapati figure. He has to be brought down. When Brahma falls, it is Pralaya. That is one level at which the story is working. Second level, which we will come to, is Bhishma's identity as a Vasu. I won't reveal that mystery right now, and I won't reveal the Ardhanari mystery right now because we will have slides on that. Same thing in Drona, right? So it is the son kills the father. This motif will go throughout the Drona Parvan. Ultimately, Drona will believe his son is gone and he will give up his life. But before that, Abhimanyu will be killed. Arjuna's son Abhimanyu is killed. Then Jayadratha is killed. Ghatotkacha, who is Bhima's son, is killed. So the whole book is worked out in terms of the relationship between sons and fathers. So the Putra continuity is explored in that book, and an individual pralaya happens. Finally, Karna and Shalya, they relate to each other. The story of the Tripura myth is told there, and they are compared in their chariot to the chariot of the two Krishnas, which is Krishna and Partha on another chariot. This is again an Upanishadic motif of the chariot, and two chariots are being contrasted. And Karna will stand for the Ahamkara that is repudiated. So it's better to look at each of these books as working out a specific problem, and in every way working out a path to moksha. So in the first step, Devayana is the path of the gods is recommended rather than the path of the ancestors, which is the path of return. As you all know, after he falls, Bhishma waits on the battlefield and waits for the Uttarayana to happen before giving up his life. So certain philosophical recommendations are being made. Okay, so very briefly now, the structure of the Bhishma Parvan begins with an 11 adhyaya or 11 section description of the continent of Jambu, and then another adhyaya 2 of the earth, Bhumi Parvan. In Western scholarship, these two Upaparvans, the 61st and the 62nd Upaparvans, are considered interpolations. Why? Because only a stupid people like the Indians would spend 14 books or 13 books talking about endless details about the continents, the plants, the inhabitants, all sorts of nonsense would fill up when everyone knows the Mahabharata is about the war. So can we hurry up and please get to the war? However, they serve a very, very important function in the Mahabharata. While these books are being narrated by Sanjaya to Dhritarashtra, the war is raging on. 10 days of war happen while these books are being narrated. On the 10th day, Bhishma falls and Sanjaya rushes in and tells Dhritarashtra, Bhishma has fallen. without these filler books, the narrative structure of the Bhishma Parvan would not work. So it's very, very important that Dhritarashtra is whiling away time. He's pausing for time. He's spinning things out, letting Sanjay narrate to him while the war is happening. And then it is too late. And we get the message that Bhishma has fallen. Also, from the perspective of Western scholarship, the Bhagavad Gita makes no sense, because who would stop a battle to give a long 700-verse lecture? If you read it as I have just shown you, the Bhagavad Gita is narrated after the death of Bhishma. So again, it is not an interruption of the chronological order of battle, but it is very carefully placed in a narrative order or an order of narration, which has deliberately inverted and played games with the chronological order of battle. And if you don't see that, then you're absolutely ripe to get a PhD in German Indology. Okay, let's now come to Bhishma's Vasu elements. So Bhishma is a Vasu, as you all know the story of the 8 Vasus who stole Vasishta's cow. They were cursed, and they said, we don't want to be born in a human yoni. So they went to Ganga and said, please take birth on earth and give birth to us, etc., etc. She, meanwhile, has a slight love affair of her own going on. So she says, yes, I will go down. And they say, don't keep us for too long. You know, as soon as we're born, liberate us. So she kills 7 of them. According to one version of the story, Vasishta says that Vasudevas, who was the one who was principally responsible for the theft of the cow, the others will be liberated soon, but you will live a long time. And that turns out to be the 8th Vasu is Bhishma. So what is the symbolism of the Vasu part of Bhishma? The Vasus are primeval elements. They are indestructible within the cosmic cycle. Now you will understand why Bhishma cannot simply be killed. His killing has to be a motive of cosmic dissolution, of pralaya. So here's the story. I don't need to tell you the story of Bhishma and his upbringing because all of you know it. I just put some, so there are a couple of slides here where we go through very quickly, which is just to refresh your memory of the story. But the last panel is important because that shows him stealing the 3 princesses of Kashi, being Ambika, Ambalika, and Amba. And as you all know, one of them cannot be married. The other 2 marry the Vichitravirya and Chitrangada, but Amba says, I have a previous lover. He says, go back. The previous lover says, no, I won't take you back. And then she comes to Bhishma and says, marry me. And he says, I can't marry you. I'm a celibate, etc., etc. And then she says, I will destroy you. So we come to understanding the entire Vasu. This is such a bright slide that it's making my face light up. The entire Vasu symbolism of the Mahabharata. I'm going to skip this slide because it will make more sense at the end when you have questions. Vishwa will come back and explain the entire Vasu descent. But believe me that the Vasu symbolism is there throughout the epic. The whole epic is pulsing with tiny Vasu elements. Okay. So what does Amba do once she is rejected? This is a beautiful illustration from Amar Chitra Katha. She goes and does penance to Shiva. She says, I'm willing to give up my body. She sacrifices herself, enters fire, is reborn as Shikhanden to destroy Amba. Now we have Amba having returned. Sorry, let me go back one. Here she is on the chariot and Arjuna is fighting. Arjuna himself is a Shaiva figure because he was revived by Shiva and bears the Pashupata weapon. And he was himself an androgen. If you remember, he was the dancer Brihannada in the court of King Virata. Shikhanden is Amba, blessed by Shiva and an Ardhanari, and Amba herself is the prototype of Sati. Arjuna's chariot is the Kapidhvaja. It has Hanuman on it, and the Maruts follow Rudra. Later, we learn that there was a man who went in front of the chariot and was doing the actual killing. And Arjuna asks Krishna, who is that man I saw? And he says, it was Kapar, then it is Shiva, it is Hara, you should bow down to that one. He did all the killing for you. Meaning the destructive force of Shiva, the force of time, goes in advance and you do nothing at all. These people's time was up. That is why you were able to kill them. Where do we get this lesson from? Anyone? Does this ring a bell for anyone? Bhagavad Gita.
Bhagavad Gita.
So you see how the Bhagavad Gita is not an addition to the text. There is not a separate war, but the war is enacting and explicating the Bhagavad Gita for us. And it is actually the living embodiment of the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, let's continue. If we approach the text this way, we also resolve a problem that really bothered the German Indologists that you see on the right of the screen. They said, what epic poet would completely neglect to take into consideration the epic situation described by him and place a philosophical conversation of 650 verses in the mouths of two of his heroes when the opposed armies are about to begin their attack? So Bhagavad Gita doesn't make sense, right? If you approach it as a straightforward war, or the Mahabharata as a straightforward journalistic account of war. And then Hermann Oldenburg has to say, how strange these theosophic teachings at such a moment, this sudden silencing of the noise of battle in the face of a mystic otherworldly stillness. And they solve that problem by saying, if it can't be, it mustn't be. And take it out. So for 200 years, they were experimenting with how much of the Bhagavad Gita you could take out in order to give you the seamless war narrative. It's a wonderful way to read text, by the way. If you're doing your exams at DU and you don't understand a question, just say, it cannot be, it mustn't be, and tear out the sheet and throw it out. And expect 100 on 100 because, you should have a little German arrogance in you at this point. No one reads text like this. No cultivated, educated person reads text like this. If something doesn't make sense, we tarry with the text. We question the text. We question our own prejudices about the text. So without understanding the war as a literary trope conveying a philosophical meaning, all sorts of pseudo problems will arise. As I pointed out, the long digression of the Jambukhanda Virmana Parvan will not make sense. The Bhagavad Gita's anomalous position, it is told on the 10th day of battle after Bhishma has fallen. So post-positive narration of the Bhagavad Gita. The war narrative is interrupted by 700 verses of a lecture. And then the Bhagavad Gita itself. So if you go back one slide, you will see that he complains about the fact that there are 650 verses in the mouth of the heroes. Why 650 in the mouth of the heroes when we all know the Bhagavad Gita is 700 verses? Because they all kind of agreed the first 50 make sense. First 50 you could have in a battle situation where a soldier doesn't want to fight and then someone says it's your Kshatriya duty, your Kshatriya dharma, you'll get heaven. That seems reasonable. So that they would have permitted. The rest of it, however, the remaining 650 elements, verses where he talks about yoga and he talks about Sankhya and he talks about Atman and so on, that has to be an interpolation into the Bhagavad Gita. So 50 verses make sense. They give us the narration, the yoga parts can be abandoned. Guess what? All those who read the Bhagavad Gita as in its entirety and read it as a work of yoga philosophy, they are on this account of the text stupid and wasting their time. And the very clever ones are the ones who see there is no yoga, there is no Bhagavad Gita, there's only a historical war, and you have to read the text historically. Okay, the Bhagavad Gita is very aware of its location in the text. This is revealed by the first verse of the Bhagavad Gita, Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre Samaveta Yuyutsavaha Mamaka Pandavaschaiva Kim Akurvata Sanjaya. This is Dhritarashtra speaking to Sanjaya. The Bhagavad Gita is well aware that it is the Dharma Kshetra, that the Kurukshetra is a symbolic field where it's the field of action. The two armies are amassed, they are facing each other, and Dhritarashtra is entering with the question of my versus the Pandavas. This aham mama bhava is what will be critiqued throughout the Bhagavad Gita. This he who makes a distinction between mine and not mine, is the problem that Krishna is trying to teach. So the text is fully aware of its position and aware of the literary significance of its position.
May I say one thing? If you go with vis-a-vis what you said about ahamkara, this links the battle directly to the Upanishadic karma kanda, jnana kanda debates that are already undertaken in the Upanishads. They're undertaken further in Shankaracharya, but before Shankaracharya, it is undertaken here in the by putting it in the Rana Yajna form. You don't have to think of ahamkara just as excessive pride, right? But when you do karma kanda, when I perform a sacrifice, when I do a sacrifice, I am the yajamana, right? I have to say, I am the yajamana, and I have to perform a sacrificial action so that my desire will be fulfilled. What is the desire? Right? Swarga kamo jyotishthomena yajeta. That a sacrificer who wishes to go to heaven must perform the karma called jyotisthoma. Now you see how Krishna's Bhagavad Gita is going to be against this aham karta, aham bhokta logic. He says, without the desire, without the kanksha or the longing for the fruit of the action, you must just perform your action. So the whole karma kanda's thesis of action, Krishna keeps it in place, but he removes agency. He removes the result. He removes the desire, and he provides the knowledge of Brahman as the infinite salvific goal. So Rana Yajna then here would be an extraordinary cogitation on what people do for the sake of their desires. After all, it's quite explicit that hatova prapsyasi swargam. So if you die here, you will go to heaven. So the battlefield is a sacrificial field. The battle is that karma kanda model that is being critiqued. And with what Joy said, with Bhishma and the Vasus, the Pralaya thesis, with Shiva motives appearing to do the Pralaya away, we are fully in an Upanishadic register throughout the war books. And the war is a superimposition, I would say, on a textual battle, a hermeneutic battle, an interpretive battle, the battle between Purva Mimamsa, Karma Kanda Mimamsa, and Jnana Kanda, which is actionless. When this war has been interpreted by Vyasa through and through, finally without any violence, with that shanti, with that peace, with that Naishkarmya Siddhi, it will appear in the Naimishal forest. You'll see that the war was just a trope. It was, in fact, if anything is added from the perspective of what really happened, Vyasa added the war. Rather, I mean, it would be stupid to say, but, and I'm not saying it, rhetorically speaking, the Germans got it upside down. The war is the interpolation. The battle action is the interpolation. How so? In the Kena Upanishad, we are told that the gods and the asuras went into battle, and the Brahman won the victory for the gods, but the gods thought they won it themselves. So Brahman appears and gives them Brahma Vidya. I'm shortening it, of course. Mahābhārata comes, and Matarishwan and Indra and so on. They go to Jata Vedas. They go to move the blade of grass, etc. But here you see how textually, if you look at it, the Mahabharata is not at all an oddity in the Indian textual tradition, which is an Akhyana tradition anyway. And the use of Akhyana for Upanishadic purposes has been done already in the Upanishads. What is the surprise? So you see the birth of this great text not in a race battle, which nobody recorded, or if it was so great, why didn't someone dig up a chariot by now, or at the bone of an elephant? You see the point here. This war is actually a war that goes on all the time, Devasura Yuddha, which has no beginning and no end. It has no beginning and no end in itself, but for those awakened souls there is. So when one reads, one must not just read the Mahabharata, because you can't read a text without its interpretation. And what is the best interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita? The Mahabharata is the best interpretation. After going through this bloody war, you will feel, I have enough of this. And even the chapters are geared in this way. For example, Sauptika Parvan, the nighttime massacre. Whatever Ashwatthama's reasons may be, first we are told an Upamana story, like seeing the crows being attacked by an owl. And then the events happen. What does that remind you, the Sauptika massacre? It reminds you of the Atiratra portion, or the overnight portion of the Jyotishtoma, or any Soma sacrifice, the days on which Soma is pressed for the sake of immortality, meaning bloodshed for the sake of heroes going to heaven. There is an Atiratra portion attached to it. So you see a Vedic Karma Kanda hermeneutic with a Vedic Jnana Kanda hermeneutic being worked out under the auspices of yoga in that large sense of emancipation or liberation. I think, Raja, we've overloaded people. Shall we take questions and stop here?
Let me just stop the share. I just want to add 2 points here. The sum up of the final statement on the presentation, the entire Kurukshetra war is not a real historical war added to some philosophy. The Kurukshetra war is there for Arjuna's yoga. The Bhagavad Gita precedes the war as the exercise or the practice of yoga. So it precedes that by giving the theory portion, which itself is told in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna will tell Arjuna, you have now heard this according to Sankhya. Now listen to it according to the practice of yoga. So you see how closely the Mahabharata is enacting the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. They work together perfectly. So the Bhagavad Gita itself gives you the theory portion. While giving you the theory portion, it says the theory portion should precede the praxis portion. Then after the Bhagavad Gita is the theory portion, the praxis portion is given to Arjuna, where he is told, now go practice yoga. Right? Imagine a situation where Krishna had given Arjuna the Bhagavad Gita and said, okay, you've gotten the theory, go home. Don't fight. Right? If the Bhagavad Gita worked as moksha shastra or worked as mokshopaya, Arjuna could very well turn around and say, hey, okay, got the moksha, read my Upanishads. I can read them at home sitting on the toilet. Let me go. No, he has to stay and fight. Why? Because the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita itself says karma must be performed. Jnana Kanda is not some theoretical praxis separate from Karma Kanda. Jnana Kanda is Karma Kanda seen under a particular light. What light is that? Giving up the desire, giving up the attachment, giving up the sense of I myself am the agent, do the action, that is called yoga. So the whole war is there for Arjuna's yoga, which means all the war books are for us, for our yoga as well, which means you should read all the war books as an exercise in yoga and not to exercise little historical facts of, which day did Bhishma fall, or was it a nuclear weapon that was exploded? No one cares. This is a yoga classroom you're entering. Okay, that was my final statement.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, somebody will, I hear them say, don't ask me who, I hear them say, but does this not teach passivity? Does this not teach people not to care about the world? Does this not come in the way of social justice? My goodness. So the answer to that is as follows. Look at where we are. Look at how we have exploited the earth. Look at how we have become greedy to the extreme. And I'm not saying any one of us in particular, all of us. Sometimes even I order from Amazon, adding packaging and burning fossil fuel and so on. To such a generation, teaching a little bit of asceticism, even as an ideal, if not actual practice, at least it may be a good thing to have a little less desire, is a great teaching. And our Krishna makes it very clear that in order to take care of the devatas in the form of panchabhutas, etc., you must act, because he who lives here without giving back is a thief, a hypocrite. And then he says, but you must act for the sake of loka samgraha. And not just act, you must act in such a way that you become a standard, a pramana, a shrestha who becomes the pramana for everybody else. So there is plenty of room for social justice here, but if you give up these ascetic ideals, then you become a glutton, and whatever you preach and say social justice without yoga is hypocrisy. Plain and simple. All right, so we'll close. Any questions for Dr. Bagchee or myself?
Yeah,
Gitesh, back to you, or Bala, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joydeep and Vishwa, for this very fascinating presentation, unraveling the deeper aspects of the text Mahabharata. Especially the question, the very first question that comes forward is, how do we read the text? And in fact, it's not just how do we read the text, how do we not read the text in a particular way?
Yeah.
So that's how shouldn't we read the text in a particular way is something that is very important, which has come out. And it is not just that. How do we read the text? For what purpose do we read the text? Is it to enter into an experiential realm, or is there any other motive with which we read the text? So you have presented a wonderful exposition of how German Indologists have read the text and what are the corrections that are required for such kind of a reading and rereading of it, etc. aspects. Especially one thing that I really liked when Joydeep was saying that we do question the text. It is not that you should not question the text. We do question the text. Along with that, we also have to question the prejudices that we might be carrying. No, that's so important for all of us when we try to enter a text of Mahabharata caliber. I'm saying caliber, no, Mahabharata caliber. So thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
So, as I understand, war is a superimposition, as Dr. Lurie pointed out, explicating the philosophical significance of the epic. What exactly is the real message of Mahabharata? Well, that's what Dr. Joydeep shed light on. I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Adluri and Dr. Bagchee for their academically captivating presence and very powerful address, which was much needed as our 25th webinar in the ongoing series. Well, thank you for removing the layers of understandings that have always been imposed on the minds when they approach the reading of our very epic of passion called Mahabharata. We need to do it on regular and consistent basis so that we can delve deeper into the meaning of the Mahabharata in a newer way or in the real way as it has been. I take this opportunity to thank our speakers on behalf of all the participants. Most importantly, on behalf of the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, as well as Kamla Nehru College. I thank our participants first to be there with us on regular basis for the last 25 Saturdays, starting from the beginning of the June. I thank Dr. Vishwa Adluri, who's there right now in US. It's morning. Thank you for sparing time for us today. Thank you, Dr. Joydeep Bagchee. I know we keep bothering them with a lot of mails, a lot of messages, but then that's a part of the ongoing project. And we all four together are as a team, and the series is definitely going on because of the ongoing project. Thank you all participants. Thank you our esteemed speakers. And I thank our departments which keep supporting us to organize all this. Thank you to our organizing team. Now, at the end, I would like to again ask all of you, request all of you to switch on your videos so that we can have screenshots for our records. Okay, I'm on page 1. So I think everybody's looking very happy. It's Saturday evening here, all gearing up for the New Year's very soon. And here, I request all of you to wear a nice smile so we can capture this. There we go. Thank you and namaskar.
Thank you.
Have a evening here in India and a happy morning to you, Dr. Alluri.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Jadi.